welcome everyone. Glad you could tune in. I know it's not Wednesday, it's Thursday, but we had some technical issues even tonight. That's why we're starting slightly late. I'm Timothy Holt, the youth pastor at 6 Points Church. Here at the house, we have a few teenagers and family members. Looking forward to getting back into our building. Couple of things. Last week we covered some interesting archaeological and historical evidence for the Christian Bible and why we care. The Gospels, there are 5,000 ancient copies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which is pretty cool. You can check out that video. I'm still working on trying to get it ported over to 90 and out at YouTube. So look for that. Also, a couple of announcements. Bishop Mackey and our State Youth Director, Joe Valentine, have announced that youth camp in August has been canceled or postponed until further notice. So I hope we can still work something out. Youth camp is a lot of fun every year. I know my kids enjoy it. I know when I was a teenager, I really enjoyed it. So I'm disappointed it got canceled, but hopefully we can still do something. I know here locally at 6 Points we're going to be planning some different outings and activities, so stay tuned for that. You can message me. If you're a youth leader in this area around 6 Points, whether that's Butler or up in Clarion or Oil City, Franklin area, get in touch with me, message me. Let's try to get something going on and go from there. Now, for this week, we are discussing Paul's first letter to the church at Corinth. We're going to do a little bit of back history. I am a big fan of, when looking at ancient documents and historical evidence, we need to ask ourselves who, what, where, when, and why. So, who wrote it? Who was the primary audience, secondary audience, and tertiary audience? What was written, when it was written, and what was going on at the time. So let's start with the author. The author of this letter is the Apostle Paul. He is also known as Saul of Tarsus. And I liked how the Encyclopedia Britannica describes Paul and his evangelistic philosophy style. So generally, Paul would go into the churches, the local synagogues with the Jewish temple, and he would try to convert Jews. He was a Jew himself, and with the exception of Athens, most of the time he got chased out of town. Let's just be honest. They didn't like him. They pretty much chased him out of church. So what do you think about that, Zayden?
Fine.
An evangelist getting chased out of church. That's
should have climbed.
Should have climbed. And then, so he would go and he would resort to tent making, which was his profession, and leather work. And I'm just going to read what the Encyclopedia Britannica has to say about it, because I like how they worded it. So, quote, moreover, he had to spend much, possibly most of his time, working to support himself as a tent maker. He worked with leather, and leather work is not noisy. While he worked, therefore, he could have taught. And once he was found to have something interesting to say, people would have dropped by from time to time to listen. It is very possible, probable, that Paul spread the gospel in this way. End quote. That is from the Encyclopedia Britannica. And I think there's something to say about that. Saul of Tarsus, a.k.a. Paul, was known as a tent maker. And in Corinth, he definitely resorted to tent making. He didn't have a lot of success right away as an evangelist and gaining money and a livelihood from evangelism. So he resorted to tent making. As a result, he met some pretty cool people like Priscilla, Aquila, and others in 51 AD when he was in Corinth. So that gets us to the letter he wrote, and that letter is dated to around 56 to 60 AD, so about 5 years after he was there. He's writing a letter back to the Christians there. So let's be honest, he wasn't writing a church like 6 Points or a cathedral. It was loosely associated Christians. And as a result, it was an open letter. So, Xander, have you ever read an open letter?
Sure.
Do you know what they are? All right, so open letters would be like somebody writing a blog on Facebook. They're addressed to a certain group of people, but pretty much anyone can read them. We see, the Democrat caucus, for example, will write an open letter to the president listing a bunch of gripes. The Republican caucus will write a open letter to the governor of Pennsylvania listing a bunch of gripes. That kind of thing. And we see that pretty often, especially in politics, even today. So Paul wrote this letter to the church at Corinth, to the Christians there. And we need to know a little bit about, this is our primary audience. So that's going to go into ancient Corinth. If you know much about Greece, Greece is basically, there's two parts of Greece. There's the Peloponnese, which is the big peninsula. That's where Sparta was. So if you're a movie buff and, the Spartan 500, what was that movie called?
I don't know.
It came out a few years ago. Had a lot of slow motion in it. Blood and guts, about the Spartans' last stand. Sparta is in the Peloponnese. You have Athens and the rest of Greece on the mainland, and separating them is this isthmus, this land bridge that's only 4 miles wide, which is pretty short, and Corinth sits right on it. So Corinth is a major metro cosmopolitan city in the Roman Empire. It is like Las Vegas, Los Angeles, and New York City all thrown together into one city. You've got Greeks there, you've got Romans, you've got people from Alexandria, travelers going from the Middle East, Syria, Lebanon. You've got trade routes going through there from the Silk Road. Basically, the ancient saying, all roads lead to Rome, well, all shipping lanes pretty much went through Corinth because it was very dangerous to travel around the Peloponnese of Greece. And as a result, they would go from all of those other, the eastern part of the Mediterranean, and they would dock in Corinth, unload their cargo, travel across land to the other side of Corinth, get on more ships, and travel on to the western part of the empire. That made Corinth the place to be. If you wanted to get a new religion going, if you want to hobnob with the rich and famous, it was in Corinth. Under Romans, Corinth was built into a major city, separating the Aegean Sea and the Ionian Sea. So, other people that get involved with this Paul Christian movement is Silas, Timothy, just looking here. You've got Gallio and Caesarea, which were proconsuls. And all of this is taking place. The other big deal with Corinth is the Greek games. The Athenian Olympics were the big games, and then the Corinth games were the junior Olympics. And they happened every 2 years. Major venues. Julius Caesar actually built a Colosseum in Corinth with a lot of emphasis on the games. So there's a lot of tent making going on. And Paul was a good tent maker. We know this through other historical evidence. And like Encyclopedia Britannica points out, it's a pretty quiet trade. I know earlier today Tori and I were using, we were working with wood, building a wood door. We're doing some finish work on it. And it's not very loud because it's all hand sanding, hand brushing with the poly. So we were able to talk the entire time. And I can just picture Paul having his open air stand, working with the leather work, and just conversing. And this is where I want to talk to the leaders. Do we have anybody in the audience there, Xander?
Yeah.
Yeah, how many we got? Just one person tuned in? Really?
No, there's 2 people there, including her.
Oh, okay. So, I want to reach out to our youth leaders and our pastors. Paul was kicked out of church. Let's just be honest about it. He was chased out of the synagogues, pretty much everywhere he went. Corinth was no different. As a result, he had to work with his hands, and ministry grew. But Priscilla and Aquila, they were tent makers. Silas was a tent maker. You probably see a pattern here. Last year, my oldest son, Zach, had the opportunity to work with one of our deacons, Ron Thompson, in building a storage shed for the community thrift store in Annandale. And he had a great time. It was very beneficial for him. He loved it. And that's how mentoring works. You don't always have to be sitting in church. But church leaders, find a teenager and mentor them. Find out what they're interested in. And if you're skilled in that area, talk to them. Work with them. Okay? That's how Paul ministered. That's how that church grew. And it grew very quickly. So that's what I've got to say about that part. Let's get into the actual book. For the next 4 Wednesdays, we're going to be looking at this because there's basically 4 sections of the letter. We're going to be covering quarrels, so fighting, arguing, bickering, that kind of stuff. Paul addresses that in the 1st through 4th chapters. Then we're going to be talking about immorality, specifically referring to drunkenness, swindlers, revelers, homosexuality, adultery, fornication. You'll probably get a theme there. There's a lot of sexual immorality going on in the church in Corinth. Chapters 5 through 11 cover that type of immorality. So stay tuned for that. We will be covering that on a Wednesday night in 2 weeks. For those of you older people who think teenagers don't think about sex, hogwash. Okay? Total hogwash. They think about sex a lot. And Paul talks about it head on. For Corinth, sexual immorality was a big deal. The biggest temple was to Athena and Aphrodite. And if you know much about Greek mythos and Roman gods, they're the goddesses of sex. And how worship took place was prostitution. Male prostitution, female prostitution, you name it. If it was a sexual vice, it was going on in that temple. It sat on the mountaintop so everybody in town could see it, hear it, and be exposed to it. And Paul addresses that head on. The next section is going to be 12 through 14, and it's confusion. And those types of aspects. Spiritual gifts, women's role in the church, the Lord's Supper, things of that nature. What makes them Christians? Being in their world, but not of it. Being set apart. So keep that in mind. We'll be talking about food that Wednesday as well. And then the last section is going to wrap up the book with chapters 15 and 16. And that is, who is Jesus Christ? Jesus, the anointed one, the only begotten Son of God, and Paul's view on where Jesus falls in relation to all of humanity. So, do we have any comments? No comments. All right. So, quick overview on Paul's first letter to the Christians in Corinth. He wasn't writing to a particular building or organization. He was writing to all of the Christians in Corinth. And it was an open letter. So, why do we care? Well, quite frankly, I'm looking forward to answering that over the next 4 Sundays. Xander, why do you think we should care?
I don't know.
You don't know? Okay. What about you, Dorothy? Don't know either? Well, I have some ideas. And I think one of them is, quite frankly, sometimes life sucks. And if you're a Christian in ancient Corinth, it kind of sucked for you. It was hard. It was laborious. You had to work very hard because the culture just was anti-Christian, to put it bluntly. So, I don't know where I was going with that. I think we're going to just end it there with... I had it here and now I can't think of it. This was by request, by the way. One of our teenagers asked us to cover 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 13 talks about love, what love it is. It's quoted heavily outside of Christian communities. So we're going to do that. So stay tuned for that in the next couple of weeks. Any comments? Nothing? Wow, this was a short session then. Let's see, we got who, what, where, when. Yeah. All right, we're gonna end it on this note right here. Okay, I found it. For I deliver to you as of first importance what I also received. By the way, this is Paul writing to the church at Corinth. I think it pertains to us today. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. That is chapter 15. So, with that, we're going to end with prayer and come back next week. God, you're awesome. Thank you so much for all of these ancient writings that sometimes we have no idea what we're doing, and other times we think we do, and we just fall on our face. You're awesome, God. Amen.